I had been camping alone for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. I had always preferred it that way. Something about being deep in the woods, away from the noise of people and the artificial hum of civilization, made me feel more at home than anywhere else. The quiet, the solitude, the sheer vastness of the wilderness. It made everything else in life seem small. I knew the risks. I was prepared for them, or at least I thought I was. This trip was supposed to be like any other. I had planned a week-long solo camping trip in a remote section of national forest. The area was thick with trees, mainly pines and oaks, rugged terrain, and very few trails. It wasn't a place many people went, and that was exactly why I had picked it. I wanted to be alone. No traffic, no voices, no distractions. Just me and the woods. I parked my truck at the edge of an old logging road, loaded up my pack, and set off. I carried everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a reliable knife, a small hatchet, a water filter, and a GPS device just in case. I wasn't reckless. I knew how to handle myself out here. I had done it plenty of times before. The first few miles were easy, just following a narrow deer trail through the trees. I moved steadily, keeping an eye on my surroundings, checking for signs of wildlife. There were tracks here and there, mostly deer and raccoon, maybe a coyote. Nothing unusual. By late afternoon, I had covered about 6 miles. The air was crisp, and the sun was beginning to dip below the trees, sending long shadows crawling across the forest floor. I found a good spot to set up camp. A small clearing surrounded by thick brush, with enough space to keep a fire contained. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. As the night settled in, I ate a simple meal of jerky and trail mix, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful. I felt at ease. That first night passed without incident. I slept soundly, waking only once when I thought I heard something moving outside my tent. But when I listened closely, there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest. Probably a raccoon or some other small animal sniffing around. I let it go and drifted back to sleep. The next day, I explored the area, venturing deeper into the woods. I followed an old game trail that wound up a hillside, leading to a rocky outcrop. From there, I had a good view of the forest stretching out in all directions. Endless trees, rolling hills, no signs of human activity. Just the way I liked it. I spent the day hiking, gathering firewood, filtering water from a nearby creek. Everything felt normal. That night, things started to feel different. I had just finished eating when I heard something, a noise off in the distance. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the background sounds of the forest. But as I sat by the fire, poking at the embers, I heard it again. A branch snapping, then another. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. It wasn't an animal. I knew that much. Animals move differently. They scurry, they dart, they don't walk in measured steps like a person does. I turned my head toward the darkness beyond the firelight, staring into the trees, my senses on high alert. But I saw nothing, just the blackness of the forest, the flickering glow of the fire casting shifting shadows across the ground. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just my mind playing tricks on me, or some animal moving through the brush. But something about it didn't sit right. I stayed up later than usual, keeping the fire going, watching, listening. After a while, when nothing else happened, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it, the sound of breathing, not my own. It was faint, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. Slow, steady, human. My blood turned cold. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where exactly it was coming from. Then footsteps, just outside, moving around my tent. Slow, deliberate, a light crunch of leaves. A pause. Another step. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tightly my hand ached. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps circled my tent once, twice, then stopped. Silence stretched on, long and suffocating. I didn't move. I just listened, waiting. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Finally, when I couldn't stay awake any longer, I dozed off, knife still clutched in my hand. Morning came, and I hesitantly unzipped my tent, stepping outside into the early light. Everything looked normal, but then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Large, human, leading from the trees, circling my tent, then disappearing back into the woods. I packed up immediately. I wasn't staying another night. I moved fast, not stopping to eat, not stopping for anything. I hiked back the way I had come, my head on a swivel, my knife in my hand. The whole way back, I felt it, that uneasy sensation of being watched. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but I knew. I just knew. When I reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sped down the logging road, not stopping until I hit pavement. Only then, with miles between me and those woods, did I let myself breathe. I never went back to that area again, and I never camped alone after that, because I wasn't alone out there, and whoever or whatever had been watching me, they wanted me to know it. The plan had been simple: 4 days alone in the wilderness. I wanted time away from everything. Work had been weighing me down, and I missed the quiet of being in nature. There was nothing quite like being surrounded by trees, the sound of the wind in the branches, and the feeling of being entirely alone. I packed light but smart, bringing everything I needed to keep myself safe and comfortable. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, food, a water filtration system, and a solid hunting knife. I had experience camping and knew how to handle myself in the backcountry. The location was remote, somewhere deep in the national forest, miles away from any marked trails. I had researched the area well: no dangerous terrain, no major predators apart from the occasional black bear, and no real threats beyond the usual risks of solo camping. I took my truck as far as the old fire road would allow before parking in a discreet spot and hiking in another 5 miles. By the time I reached my chosen campsite, the sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The first night was peaceful. I set up camp near a small, slow-moving stream, the sound of running water a comforting presence in the quiet. I gathered firewood, cooked a small meal, and sat by the fire until the embers glowed red against the darkness. The air was crisp, and aside from the occasional rustle in the underbrush, there was nothing unusual about the night. The next morning, I woke early, feeling well-rested. I boiled water for coffee and sat by the fire pit, watching the forest come alive. Birds flitted between branches, a squirrel chattered nearby, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine. After breakfast, I took a short hike, following the stream deeper into the forest. I had marked my way carefully, ensuring I wouldn't lose my bearings. It was on my way back that I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. A footprint. Not mine. Not an animal's. A human print, half sunk in the damp soil near the edge of the stream. It was fresh, no more than a few hours old. I hadn't seen a soul since leaving my truck. There were no established trails out here, and I had deliberately chosen this location for its isolation. I stared at the print for a long time, my mind running through possibilities. Maybe a hunter, maybe another camper, but there had been no signs of another campsite, no distant sounds of people, no smoke from fires. I pushed the thought away and made my way back to camp, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut. That night, I stayed up later than usual, my fire burning brighter and hotter than the night before. Every snap of a twig made my heart pound a little harder. I told myself it was nothing, a stray hiker maybe, or someone who had been passing through. But deep down, I knew it didn't add up. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area a little more, trying to reassure myself that there was nothing to worry about. I followed the stream in the opposite direction this time, noting small changes in the terrain and memorizing landmarks. An hour into my hike, I found something else, a second footprint, this one even fresher, and it wasn't alone. There were several prints spaced apart as if someone had been walking slowly, deliberately. I crouched down, examining them closely. The size was similar to the first, but something about them felt off. They were leading toward my campsite. I stood up quickly, my pulse hammering. I wasn't alone out here. I moved quickly, cutting straight back toward my camp. My mind was racing. If someone had been following me, they hadn't made themselves known. They hadn't called out, hadn't announced their presence. Why? When I arrived back, everything was exactly as I had left it. My tent was undisturbed, my food untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked my gear, making sure everything was in place. My knife was still on my belt, my pack still secured. But the firewood I had gathered earlier, it was moved. Not much, just a little, but enough that I knew it hadn't been me. I barely slept that night. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt like a trap. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow longer. I lay in my sleeping bag, my knife in my hand, listening. And then, just past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They weren't animal footsteps. They were human, moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. I held my breath, gripping the handle of my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The footsteps circled my camp once, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Minutes passed, and then, finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the forest. I didn't wait for morning. As soon as the first light crept through the trees, I packed my gear, doused the fire, and left. I moved fast, covering the 5 miles back to my truck in record time. When I reached it, my hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I threw my pack in the back, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what had happened. The ranger listened, nodding, but when I finished, he just shrugged. "There have been reports like yours before," he said. "Tracks, signs of someone out there, but we never find anyone. That was the last time I camped alone. Somewhere in those woods, there had been someone else, watching, waiting, and I have no idea what would have happened if I had stayed another night." The sky was already a deep shade of gray when I set up camp. I had hiked most of the day through thick forest, following a barely marked trail deep into the backcountry. This was how I liked it. Far from any roads, any signs of other people. Just me, my pack, and the woods. I chose a spot near a small creek, where the land leveled out just enough for my tent. The trees were thick here, their trunks gnarled and covered in moss, with roots pushing up from the ground like the fingers of something buried. The creek gurgled softly, barely more than a trickle, but I liked the sound. It would drown out any smaller noises of the forest that might otherwise wake me. I built a small fire, enough to cook a simple meal, and sat on a fallen log, watching the flames flicker against the encroaching dark. As the sun fully disappeared behind the trees, I felt it, the weight of the wilderness. It was always there, a subtle shift in presence when the light faded. The woods had a way of closing in at night, the darkness feeling deeper than it should. I had camped alone many times, so this wasn't new to me, but I still noticed it every time. I finished eating, packed away my food properly, and let the fire die down. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds around me. The occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the murmur of the creek. My breathing slowed as I let myself drift, exhaustion from the long day settling in. Then something snapped in the woods. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. A branch breaking, heavier than a falling limb, deliberate in a way that made my skin prickle. I held my breath, listening. The usual night sounds had faded, replaced with silence. Even the creek seemed quieter. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the trees, stepping on fallen wood. But I knew what deer sounded like. This was different. I stayed awake for a long time, listening, waiting. When no other sounds came, I forced myself to relax. Eventually, sleep took me. I woke suddenly, heart hammering, unsure why. The fire was completely out. The forest was still dark. I listened again, every muscle tense. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not heavy, not rushed. Just slow, careful movements somewhere beyond the edge of my camp. They stopped for a long time, then started again. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just focused on the sounds. Something or someone was there, watching. Minutes passed. The steps moved again, fading into the distance. I stayed awake until the first hint of dawn filtered through the trees. In the morning, I forced myself to check the area. The ground was soft in places, damp from the creek, and I saw them, footprints. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. I packed up fast. I hadn't seen another person in days, and no one should have been out here, walking barefoot in the middle of the night. I kept my knife in hand as I hiked back. The feeling of being watched never left me, not even after I reached my car. Only when I was miles away, driving down the empty road back toward town, did I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. 2 nights deep in the wilderness, away from work, noise, and people. I had been planning this solo trip for months, researching a lesser-known trail that cut through a national forest where few hikers ventured. It wasn't on any major camping forums, just a small, tucked-away location I had read about in an old hiking book. The idea of total solitude was what appealed to me the most. No crowds, no designated campsites, just me and the wild. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 4 hours, most of it on winding back roads that seemed to grow narrower with each passing mile. Eventually, the pavement turned to gravel, then dirt, and then nothing more than a pair of tire ruts barely cutting through the trees. By the time I reached my intended starting point, the forest had completely swallowed the road behind me. There were no signs, no other vehicles. Just me, my gear, and the promise of an isolated weekend. I set off in the late morning, following an old footpath that barely resembled a trail anymore. The trees grew thick, their twisted roots forcing me to watch every step. It was slow going, but that was part of the appeal. The deeper I went, the more distant the world behind me felt. It was perfect. The first few miles were uneventful. The only sounds were my own footsteps, the occasional rustling of unseen animals, and the distant call of birds. I spotted deer once, standing motionless between the trees before bounding away at the first sign of my presence. The solitude felt peaceful. By mid-afternoon, I had covered close to 7 miles and decided to make camp near a small clearing just off the trail. It wasn't much, a flat patch of dirt nestled between towering pines, but it would do. Setting up was second nature. Tent staked, sleeping bag unrolled, small fire built for cooking. I had packed light but efficiently. A simple meal, a quick drink of water from my filter, and the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The night would come fast. As the last of the daylight faded, I noticed something strange. A structure barely visible through the dense undergrowth. Not a cabin or a shack, but something that looked man-made. I left my fire burning and grabbed my flashlight, pushing through the thick foliage until I stood before it. It was an old wooden picnic table, long abandoned. The wood was warped, covered in moss and fungi, but still intact. Scattered around it were remnants of past campers. Rusted tin cans, shattered glass, and what might have once been a fire pit, now just a sunken ring of blackened stones. I wasn't sure why, but something about the forgotten picnic table unsettled me. It didn't belong here. There had been no mention of a campsite in the book, no signs indicating this place had ever been used officially. Yet here it was, hidden beneath years of growth. Felt wrong. Shaking off the unease, I returned to my fire, telling myself I was just being dramatic. Old campsites were everywhere. Maybe this was part of some long-forgotten trail. Maybe it had simply been overlooked on the maps. Either way, it wasn't my problem. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke to the sound of birds, stretched, and started packing. My plan was to move deeper into the forest, find another clearing, and spend my second night even further from civilization. I should have left when I had the chance. The second day was harder. The terrain became rougher, the trees closing in even tighter. The underbrush thickened, and I had to hack through sections of it with my knife. I had expected a challenge, but by mid-afternoon, I was exhausted. That's when I found the second campsite. Like the first, it was overgrown, forgotten. Another moss-covered picnic table, another fire ring lost to time. But this one had more remnants of old tarps tangled in the branches, a rusted-out folding chair leaning against a tree, and most disturbingly, a single hiking boot, half buried in the dirt. It was old, its leather cracked, the sole peeling away. But what bothered me most was that it was just one, not a pair, just a single boot, discarded as if its owner had left in a hurry. A feeling of unease settled over me again, heavier this time. There was no reason for two identical, abandoned campsites to exist out here. No trails led to them, no signs of recent visitors. Just these relics of people who had been here once and never returned. I should have turned back, but I didn't. Stubbornness, maybe, or pride. I had come for solitude, and I wasn't about to let my own imagination ruin that. I moved on, forcing myself deeper into the forest. By the time I set up camp that evening, the weight of exhaustion had drowned out my unease. My fire crackled, my food sizzled, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that I was being ridiculous. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not because of a noise, not because of movement, but because something felt wrong. The air was still, deathly silent. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. Just complete, suffocating quiet. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible beyond the edge of my firelight. Just standing there, motionless. My body froze. My breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, to grab my knife, to run. But I couldn't. I just stared, heart hammering in my chest. It was tall, human-shaped, but no details beyond that. The fire was too dim, the shadows too thick. But it was there, watching. And then, just as suddenly as I had noticed it, it was gone. A blink, a shift of my head, and the space where it had stood was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, eyes locked on the darkness beyond my camp. Nothing else moved. Nothing else came. To first light, I packed up and left. I didn't eat, didn't rest, didn't look back. I hiked faster than I ever had in my life, the weight of my pack forgotten. When I reached my truck, I barely took the time to toss my gear inside before peeling out onto the overgrown road. I never went back. I never tried to find that trail again. I didn't want to know who had camped there before me. I didn't want to know what had happened to them. And I didn't want to know what had been standing in the dark, watching me sleep. I had been planning the solo camping trip for months. It was something I did once or twice a year, heading deep into the wilderness for a few nights, far away from any roads or trails where I could enjoy the quiet and isolation. This time, I chose a remote section of national forest land in Idaho, a place I'd scouted on maps but had never actually visited. The terrain was rugged, with thick forests, steep ridges, and deep valleys. No official trails led into the area, and I would be completely alone. That was the whole point. I parked my truck at a pull-off along a dirt road, shouldered my pack, and started hiking. The plan was to bushwhack about 5 miles in and set up camp near a small creek. I had enough supplies for 4 nights: food, water purification tablets, my tent, and a few other essentials. The hike in was tough, with thick underbrush and deadfalls slowing me down. It took longer than expected, but by late afternoon, I found a perfect campsite. A small clearing near the creek, flat enough to pitch my tent, and surrounded by tall pines that offered some wind protection. After setting up camp, I spent the evening collecting firewood and cooking a simple meal on my small stove. The sun dipped below the tree line, and the forest became a deep, shadowy maze. I always enjoyed this part of the trip, the moment when daylight faded and the world grew quiet except for the sounds of the woods. The wind rustled the trees, and the creek babbled softly nearby. The solitude was comforting. I slept well that first night. The air was cool but not too cold, and my sleeping bag kept me warm. I woke up once in the middle of the night to a distant sound, something moving through the underbrush far from camp. It wasn't unusual. Deer, elk, and even bears roamed these woods, but I had taken precautions, hanging my food bag high in a tree away from my tent. After listening for a moment and hearing nothing more, I drifted back to sleep. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it exploring, following the creek upstream and enjoying the isolation. I came across signs of wildlife, scattered bones from an old kill, claw marks on a tree likely made by a black bear, and fresh deer tracks in the soft mud. By the time I made it back to camp in the afternoon, I was exhausted. I made dinner, stoked the fire, and watched the sun set again. That night, I woke up to something different. A sound closer this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal too heavy. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps stopped. Silence. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could be another camper, but I hadn't seen a single person since leaving my truck. And this wasn't a popular area. No trails, no reason for anyone else to be here. I lay in my tent, unmoving, straining to hear. Then, just as I started to think I had imagined it, I heard it again. A single step, then another, and another. Whatever it was moving around my campsite. Not rushing, not stumbling, just slow, patient movements. I reached for my knife, my only real weapon besides a small hatchet. The fire had died down, leaving only a few faintly glowing embers. I debated what to do. If I stayed silent, maybe whoever or whatever it was would move on. If I made noise, would it scare them off? Or would it make things worse? Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. Just the normal night sounds of the forest. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The fire had burned low, casting faint light over my camp. Nothing seemed out of place. I scanned the trees, my heart pounding. Still nothing. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump. I considered packing up and hiking out in the dark, but bushwhacking through unfamiliar terrain at night wasn't a good idea. The first light, I was up, packing my gear. I had planned to stay another 2 nights, but I wasn't going to risk it. Something felt wrong. As I packed up, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tracks in the soft dirt near my tent. Not boot prints, bare feet, human. I felt a deep, primal fear settle into my gut. I wasn't alone out here, and whoever had been walking around my camp had been watching me. I finished packing as fast as I could, slinging my pack onto my shoulders and gripping my knife tightly. The hike back to my truck was brutal. I moved fast, almost running at times, ignoring the burning in my legs. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't let my guard down until I saw my truck through the trees. When I reached it, I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Only then did I let myself breathe. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. As I pulled onto the dirt road and started heading back toward civilization, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Standing at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Tall, barefoot, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I reached a town, checked into the first motel I found, and locked the door behind me. I never went back to that area. I don't know who or what I encountered out there, and I don't want to. I had planned the trip for months. A solo camping excursion deep into the woods of northern Minnesota, far from any trails or campsites. I wanted solitude, real solitude, the kind that made you feel like the last person left on Earth. I had done trips like this before, but never this deep, never this isolated. It was late September, the air crisp but not yet bitter. The leaves had turned, the colors brilliant against the endless pine backdrop. I parked my truck at a small pull-off along a desolate forest road and set out on foot. My pack was heavy with gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and everything else I might need for a few nights alone. I planned to hike about 10 miles in before setting up camp. The terrain was rough, a mix of dense forest and rocky outcroppings, but I enjoyed the challenge. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing near a small, still lake. The water was dark, perfectly reflecting the trees that lined the shore. It was the kind of place that felt untouched, hidden. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and started setting up camp. By the time the sun began to dip below the trees, I had a fire going. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and then sat back against a log, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that only true wilderness could provide. No cars, no people, no distant hum of civilization. Just the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. The first night passed without incident. I slept well, waking only once to the distant howls of coyotes. By morning, a thick fog had rolled in over the lake, making everything feel smaller, closer. I boiled water for coffee, ate a granola bar, and then spent the day exploring the area. I found old game trails, a few scattered deer bones, and a small ridge with a perfect view of the valley below. As evening approached, I made my way back to camp. That's when I first noticed it. A small change, something subtle. A stick, half buried in the dirt near my tent, was now standing upright. I was sure it hadn't been like that when I left. I frowned, glanced around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Maybe I had kicked it, or maybe it had been that way all along, and I just hadn't noticed. That night, as I sat by the fire, I felt something shift in the atmosphere. The forest, once a comforting presence, felt different, like it was watching me. The feeling was irrational, but it crawled under my skin. I forced myself to shake it off, finished my meal, and climbed into my tent. I woke up in the middle of the night. No sound, no movement, just an overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The tent door was still zipped. Everything inside was as I had left it. I listened, holding my breath. The silence was thick, unnatural. Then, from somewhere outside, the crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate. I held still, gripping my knife. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Another step. Close. Too close. I flicked off the flashlight, plunged the tent back into darkness. I sat there, waiting, every muscle tensed. And then silence again. Minutes stretched. My mind raced. Could be an animal. A deer, maybe. But deer didn't move like that. Not with that measured pace. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and lay back down. But sleep didn't come easy. By morning, I found nothing outside the tent. No tracks, no disturbances. But that feeling lingered, the gnawing unease. I considered packing up, but I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. I spent the day exploring again, but this time, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Every time I turned, I expected to see something, someone, just behind me. But there was nothing, just trees. That night, I built my fire higher. I sat closer to it, knife in hand, ears straining against the night. And then, just past midnight, the sound returned. Footsteps, slow, careful, circling. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees. Nothing, but the sound stopped the second the beam passed over. I stayed up the rest of the night, heart pounding, knife in a white-knuckled grip. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. As I packed, I found something just outside my tent. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly, deliberately. I hadn't put them there. I left immediately, hiking fast, barely stopping to rest. But as I moved, I felt it again. That presence, unseen but undeniable. The hairs on my neck stayed raised the entire way back. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. Only then did I breathe. Only then did I feel safe. I never figured out what was out there. Person, maybe, but why? And how had they moved so quietly, so precisely? I never went back. Some places aren't meant to be found. The air was thick with humidity as I trudged through the overgrown trail, my pack digging into my shoulders with every step. It was late summer, and the heat of the day hadn't quite given way to the coolness of the evening. Sweat clung to my skin, and the sound of cicadas filled the heavy air. I had been hiking alone for the past few days, following a remote section of national forest land that was rarely visited. It was exactly what I had wanted: seclusion, quiet, and a break from the relentless pace of everyday life. The plan was to spend one more night out here before looping back toward my truck the next morning. I had found a promising-looking clearing on my map, not far from a slow-moving creek, and decided to set up camp there. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The place was perfect: flat, dry, and just far enough from the water that I wouldn't have to worry about bugs swarming me all night. I dropped my pack and stretched out my sore back before setting up my small tent. The routine was comforting, familiar. Pitching the tent, rolling out my sleeping pad, hanging my food bag high in a tree. I built a small fire, mostly for the light and the sense of security it provided. As the sky darkened, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of dehydrated chili and sipping cool water from my bottle. The forest was alive with sound: crickets, the occasional rustling in the brush, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, and for a while, I simply enjoyed the quiet, letting my muscles relax. Then something changed. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. The usual night sounds had faded, replaced by a heavy silence. I hadn't even realized it until I went to set my food bag aside and noticed how still everything had become. The cicadas had stopped. The crickets had stopped. Even the distant owl had gone silent. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Silence in the woods wasn't normal. It usually meant one thing: something was moving nearby. I held still, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, from somewhere beyond the tree line, I heard it. A branch snapping. Not the small, insignificant crack of a twig beneath a rabbit's foot. No, this was the sharp, deliberate snap of something large stepping down on dead wood. My mind immediately started running through the possibilities. A deer, maybe. A bear? But the sound had come from a distance that suggested whatever it was had weight to it. I reached for my headlamp and flicked it on, sweeping the beam toward the trees. The darkness seemed to swallow the light, and I saw nothing but tangled undergrowth and thick trunks. Then another sound. This time it was softer, leaves rustling. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding hard in my chest. I wasn't new to the woods. I knew what a bear moving through the brush sounded like. I knew the clumsy steps of a startled deer. But this felt different. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. If it was an animal, making noise was usually enough to scare it off. I grabbed my trekking pole and smacked it hard against a tree trunk. The sharp crack echoed through the forest, but whatever was out there didn't bolt. It didn't move at all, and that was the part that scared me the most. Predators, whether animal or human, don't always run. A sudden wave of adrenaline flooded my body, and I quickly ran through my options. I had a knife, bear spray, and a fire, but none of those felt particularly comforting at the moment. The safest thing to do would be to pack up and leave, but hiking out in the dark through miles of rugged terrain wasn't exactly a good idea either. I strained my ears, waiting, listening. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, just as I began to think that maybe, just maybe, it had been nothing, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A footstep. A single, deliberate footstep. Not an animal. Not something four-legged. A foot. A human foot stepping on dry leaves. My mouth went dry. I slowly reached down, grabbed my knife, and held it tight in my palm. My fire was burning low now, casting flickering shadows all around me. My headlamp felt weak against the pressing darkness. Another step. Closer. I fought the urge to run. Running meant panic, and panic led to mistakes. Instead, I took a slow step backward toward my tent, my mind racing through my options. I could douse the fire, sit in the darkness, and wait. I could grab my bag and move fast, hoping I could put distance between myself and whoever, or whatever, was out there. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came alive again. Crickets chirped, the cicadas droned, and the night sounds returned as if nothing had ever happened. The pressure in my chest eased slightly, but the unease remained. I stood there for a long time, gripping my knife, straining to hear anything over the renewed hum of the forest. Nothing. No more footsteps. No more movement. Finally, I forced myself to sit, forcing down the lingering fear. I kept my fire burning brighter than usual that night, dozing in and out of a restless sleep. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I wasted no time breaking camp. My hands were steady, my movements quick and efficient. I didn't stop for breakfast. I didn't linger. As I hoisted my pack and prepared to leave, I hesitated, glancing back toward the tree line where I had heard the footsteps the night before. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Large, adult-sized bare feet in the damp earth, just beyond the light of my fire. The prints were fresh, deep, leading right up to my camp. I left without looking back.